Today we will explore two natural materials that sustained entire civilizations during the Middle Ages. Resources forgotten by time that transformed the way our ancestors healed wounds, navigated oceans, built weapons, and faced the darkness. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine a battlefield in the heart of medieval Europe. The year could be any between the 10th and 15th centuries, and the scene would always be the same. Men fallen upon the damp earth, wounded by swords, spears, and arrows. The smell of blood mixed with mud. Screams that blend with the wind. There are no ambulances, no operating rooms illuminated by powerful lamps, no antibiotics packaged in white pills. In those times, a simple cut on the skin could mean the difference between life and death. Infection was an enemy as lethal as any steel blade, and yet those men and women survived. Not all of them, evidently, but a surprising number of them found ways to treat serious injuries with resources that nature offered within arm's reach. The question that arises is, how? How did a civilization devoid of pharmaceutical laboratories manage to face infections, build entire fleets of ships capable of crossing violent seas, manufacture reliable weapons, and illuminate the deep darkness of nights without electricity? The answer is hidden in two materials that most modern people do not even know. Two gifts of nature that together formed what can be called a complete medieval survival system. And the story of how our ancestors discovered and mastered these resources is as fascinating as any epic adventure ever told. Let's start with the first of them. And to understand it, we need to walk into a pine forest. There is something deeply silent about a coniferous forest. The trees rise like living columns, their trunks covered by a thick and rugged bark that guards millennial secrets. If someone approaches a pine tree and observes carefully, they will notice something curious. At certain points on the trunk, especially where the bark has been damaged by a storm, by an animal attack, or simply by the wear of time, there is a golden and sticky substance slowly oozing across the surface of the wood. This substance is pine resin. To the touch, it is viscous and adherent. When exposed to the air for long enough, it hardens and assumes an amber coloration, almost translucent, like a jewel imprisoned by time. And that is exactly what it represents for the tree, a defense. When the pine tree suffers a wound, its resinous canals spring into action. The resin flows to the damaged area and solidifies, creating a protective barrier that prevents the entry of fungi, bacteria, and insects. The tree, in its biological wisdom accumulated over millions of years of evolution, developed its own first aid system. And it was medieval human beings who, observing this phenomenon with attentive eyes and curious minds, realized that what healed the tree might also be able to heal them. It is not known exactly when this discovery was first made. It is likely that knowledge about the properties of resin was passed down orally for countless generations, long before any written record. Ancient peoples of Mesopotamia already used resinous substances in embalming rituals and rudimentary medicinal practices. The Egyptians employed resins in the mummification process. The Greeks and Romans documented the use of resin-based preparations to treat wounds and skin diseases. But it was during the Middle Ages, in a period often described as an age of darkness and ignorance, that the use of pine resin reached a truly remarkable level of sophistication. Necessity, as always, was the great teacher. The medieval European lived surrounded by dangers that modern man can barely imagine. Constant wars, devastating epidemics, brutal winters, and a life expectancy that rarely exceeded 40 years. In this implacable scenario, every available natural resource was exploited to the limit, and pine resin proved to be one of the most versatile. In its simplest form, fresh and soft resin, newly collected from the trunk of a wounded pine, could be applied directly onto a cut or an open wound. The effect was almost immediate. The sticky substance adhered to the skin, stopped the bleeding, and created a protective layer that sealed the wound against the dirt and microorganisms present in the environment. In a world where even a superficial scratch could evolve into a fatal infection, this ability to seal and protect wounds was extraordinarily valuable. But medieval healers did not limit themselves to this basic use. Over time, they developed processing techniques that transformed raw resin into more effective and easier-to-apply medicinal preparations. The method consisted of gently heating the resin over a fire in a controlled manner until it became liquid. In this state, the resin could be combined with other natural ingredients. Animal fat, for example, was frequently added to give the preparation a smoother and more spreadable consistency. Beeswax was another common ingredient, used to stabilize the mixture and prolong its shelf life. The result of this process was an ointment that medieval people applied to wounds of all types: deep cuts caused by swords and daggers, burns caused by the fire of forges and fireplaces, skin rashes, and other skin conditions. This resinous ointment was, in essence, the antibiotic ointment of the Middle Ages. And the most surprising thing is that modern science has come to confirm that those healers were absolutely right. Recent scientific studies have demonstrated that pine and fir resin possess genuinely antiseptic, antibacterial, and anti-inflammatory properties. Researchers have verified that compounds present in the resin are capable of inhibiting the growth of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, such as methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, known by the acronym MRSA, one of the greatest threats in contemporary hospital medicine. Medieval healers had no microscopes, did not know the theory of germs, and had never heard of antibacterial molecules. But through centuries of practical experimentation, trial and error, and careful observation of results, they reached conclusions that proved to be scientifically valid. The empirical wisdom of those men and women, passed down from generation to generation, anticipated discoveries that modern laboratories would only confirm many centuries later. The medicinal versatility of pine resin did not stop at war wounds. Medieval people used it to treat burns of different degrees of severity, applying layers of the resinous ointment over the injured skin to relieve pain and prevent infection. Another ingenious use consisted of employing the resin as an extraction agent. When a thorn or a splinter became deeply lodged in the skin, a generous layer of resin was applied over the affected spot. As the resin hardened, it adhered to the foreign body and, when removed, brought the splinter or thorn with it, along with any impurities. Healers also incorporated resin into treatments for various dermatological conditions. Eczema, skin irritations, and chronic wounds were treated with variations of resinous ointments, each formulation adapted to the specific condition. This was not a matter of superstition or magic. It was practical and functional medicine, derived from a deep understanding of the resources offered by the forest. But pine resin still held many other faces. To understand them, we need to leave the healer's tents and walk to the edge of the sea, where the sound of the waves mixes with the creaking of timber and the unmistakable odor of tar. Any maritime civilization of medieval Europe faced a monumental challenge: the construction of ships capable of resisting the fury of the oceans. A wooden ship, no matter how well built, was essentially a vulnerable structure. The planks of the hull were fitted side by side, but between them there were always small gaps, crevices imperceptible to the naked eye, yet sufficient to allow the slow and constant entry of seawater. If these gaps were not sealed with precision, the ship would be doomed. The wood would absorb water, swell, and rot. The hull would lose its structural integrity. And at some point, in the middle of a storm or even in apparently calm waters, the ship would sink, taking its crew and cargo with it. The solution to this problem came once again from the pine trees. Pine resin, when subjected to a more intense transformation process, gave rise to two fundamental substances for medieval naval engineering: pine tar and pitch. The tar was obtained through a process known as destructive distillation, a technique that required skill, patience, and a deep knowledge of the behavior of wood under heat. Specialized workers, known in various European regions as tar burners, selected pine wood rich in resin. This wood was carefully piled inside special kilns, built from stones or excavated directly into the ground and lined with clay. The structure was then covered so as to severely limit the entry of oxygen. The wood was heated slowly over several days in a controlled process that prevented complete combustion. Deprived of sufficient oxygen to burn, the wood gradually decomposed, releasing a thick, dark substance that flowed to the bottom of the kiln and was collected in containers. This black and viscous liquid was pine tar, The smell of pine tar was the defining aroma of all the shipyards of medieval Europe. It was a strong, penetrating, almost intoxicating odor that impregnated the clothes of the workers, the wood of the docks, and the very air around the port facilities. Shipbuilders used the tar in a process called caulking. Fibers of hemp or oakum were soaked in hot tar and then carefully hammered into every gap between the planks of the hull. This work required meticulous precision. Every joint, every seam, every point of vulnerability was treated individually. The tar-soaked fiber, when compressed into the gaps, created a flexible and water-resistant seal. This flexibility was crucial, as the hull of a ship is not a rigid structure. It moves constantly under the action of the waves, and a brittle seal would quickly break. The tar gave the seal the necessary elasticity to follow the movements of the hull without losing its integrity. After the caulking of all the joints, the entire hull was often coated with additional layers of hot pitch. Pitch was obtained from the tar itself through prolonged heating that evaporated the more volatile components and produced a thicker and more solid substance. Applied in a liquid state over the external surface of the hull, the pitch solidified upon cooling, forming a kind of black armor that protected the wood against the corrosive action of salt water, against the ultraviolet rays of the sun, and against a particularly feared enemy, the shipworm Teredo navalis, a boring mollusk that fed on submerged wood and could destroy an entire hull in a matter of months. Naval historical records indicate that ships properly treated with tar and pitch could last for decades, even when subjected to the extreme conditions of the North Sea. The British Navy, whose naval supremacy shaped the history of the modern world, was so dependent on pine tar that ensuring a constant supply of this substance became a matter of national security. Entire pine forests in Scandinavia and the American colonies were exploited to feed the insatiable demand of British shipyards. But the genius of pine resin in the fight against water was not restricted to large warships and commercial vessels. The same principles of waterproofing were applied on a smaller scale, yet one equally vital in the daily life of medieval populations. Soldiers on campaign who marched for weeks under endless rains depended on clothing and equipment treated with tar and pitch to stay dry and functional. A soaked soldier was not just uncomfortable, he was a soldier vulnerable to hypothermia, lung diseases and foot wounds that could permanently incapacitate him. Farmers and shepherds who spent long hours exposed to the elements in the fields used similar techniques to waterproof their leather boots, their canvas cloaks, and their work equipment. From the longships of Norse explorers to the modest boots of a peasant in the interior of France, pine resin was the essential technology for keeping the water on the outside. It was the medieval answer to the synthetic waterproofing materials that would only emerge many centuries later. Now consider another scenario of medieval life: a craftsman's workshop lit by the flickering light of a tallow candle. On the workbench, an axe with a loose handle, or perhaps an arrow whose iron head has detached from the wooden shaft. In the modern world, when something breaks, it is usually enough to replace it. There are specialized stores and industrial adhesives for every conceivable need. But in medieval Europe, a broken axe handle or a loose arrowhead was not just a domestic inconvenience. It could potentially be a death sentence. The axe was an essential tool for cutting firewood, building shelters, and, in many cases, defending one's own life. The arrow was a fundamental weapon on battlefields and in the hunts that provided food for families. Losing the functionality of these tools was simply not an option. And once again, pine resin provided the solution. When heated gently, pine resin becomes extraordinarily sticky. Upon cooling, it hardens and forms a resistant solid. This dual property, as a thermoplastic adhesive, was exploited by medieval craftsmen to create what can be described as a hot melt glue hundreds of years before the invention of modern electric glue guns. The basic recipe was simple, but the execution required knowledge and experience. The resin was melted and mixed with additives that significantly improved its properties. The most common of these additives was powdered charcoal. The addition of finely pulverized charcoal drastically increased the mechanical strength of the adhesive, transforming the pure resin, which tended to be brittle, into a much tougher and impact-resistant composite material. Some craftsmen also added crushed shells or bone dust, which functioned as mineral reinforcements and gave even more robustness to the mixture. The most critical use of this resinous adhesive was in the manufacturing and repair of weapons and tools. The process of fixing an arrowhead to a wooden shaft, technically termed hafting, required an adhesive capable of withstanding the tremendous impact of the moment the arrow hit the target. A weak adhesive meant a tip that detached at the first impact, making the arrow useless. The craftsman would heat the pitch glue, apply the hot substance to both surfaces to be joined, fit the pieces together, and then wrap the joint with animal sinew or plant cordage. As the glue cooled, it solidified, forming an extremely solid bond that could withstand repeated shocks. The same technique was employed to fix axe blades to their handles, to assemble knife handles, and to join components of countless other tools essential to daily life. In addition to tool manufacturing, pitch glue functioned as a universal repair kit. A cracked pot could be fixed with a careful application of resinous glue. Damaged agricultural implements, broken transport equipment, shattered household utensils, all could receive temporary or permanent repairs with this versatile adhesive. Medieval craftsmen even developed an ingenious portable solution, sticks of solidified pitch that could be easily carried in a pocket or a travel bag. When the need for a quick repair arose in the field, one only had to hold the end of the stick over a flame, to melt a few drops of the adhesive and apply them over the damaged area. It was a truly indispensable survival item, the medieval equivalent of a multi-purpose adhesive tape that fit in the palm of the hand. And there was yet another domain in which pine resin played a role that was perhaps the most fundamental of all, a domain that modern man, surrounded by light switches and glowing screens, can barely imagine: the domain of darkness. Before electricity, the world plunged into a deep and absolute darkness at nightfall. There were no streetlights on the roads, no electric lamps in the houses. When the sun dipped below the horizon, life practically ceased for most people. Work in the fields became impossible. Traveling at night was extremely risky, not only because of the lack of visibility, but also because the dark paths were the territory of thieves and predatory animals. Inside the houses, the darkness was oppressive and limiting. The ability to create reliable artificial light was, therefore, a revolutionary technology, as transformative in its time as electricity would come to be many centuries later. And pine resin, with its highly flammable nature and exceptional combustion properties, was the fuel that made this light possible. Pine resin burns with a significantly brighter and longer-lasting flame than ordinary wood. This characteristic made it ideal for lighting applications, particularly in the making of torches. A medieval torch was a sturdy piece of wood with cloth wrapped around the upper end, soaked in some type of fuel. Although animal fat could be used, pine pitch was vastly superior. The thick and sticky substance impregnated the fibers of the cloth and functioned as a concentrated source of energy, producing a bright flame that resisted the wind better and lasted considerably longer. But nature offered an even more elegant and simple solution. Pine forests naturally produced an extraordinary material. When a pine tree dies, the resin present in its trunk begins to concentrate in the lowest parts of the tree, especially in the stump and the roots. Over months and years, the wood in these regions becomes progressively saturated with resin, reaching extraordinarily high concentrations. This impregnated wood possessed remarkable combustion properties. It was extremely easy to ignite even in high humidity conditions, which made it an exceptional fire starter in rainy climates. Larger pieces, often found in the knots of dead trees, functioned as natural candles. Once lit, they burned steadily for hours, emitting a constant light and a pleasant aroma. These resinous pine knots were coveted treasures in rural communities, especially in the densely forested regions of northern Europe, where winters were long, somber, and relentlessly cold. Families collected these materials during the milder seasons and stored them carefully for use during the months of winter darkness. From the soft glow of a pine knot burning slowly in a corner of the house to the flaming flare of a tar-soaked torch, pine resin was the fuel that pushed the medieval darkness back. Now that we understand the extraordinary versatility of pine resin, from healing wounds to building ships, from manufacturing weapons to lighting the night, a fundamental question arises. How exactly did medieval people harvest and process this material? The answer reveals a level of technical sophistication that challenges the simplistic image we often have of the Middle Ages. The simplest and oldest method of obtaining resin consisted of opportunistic collection. People simply walked through the forests in search of pine trees that already showed natural wounds caused by storms, ice, animals, or diseases. At these points of damage, the resin accumulated in drops and solidified amber-colored masses, which could be removed with a knife or even a pointed stick. This method did not harm healthy trees and provided a reasonably constant supply. For larger quantities, they practiced controlled extraction. Using a sharp tool, they made shallow, angled incisions in the bark, creating V-shaped channels. The depth of the cut was crucial, enough to reach the resinous channels, but not so deep as to seriously damage the tree. Containers or carved wooden spouts were fixed below the channels to collect the resin. Experienced collectors knew the seasonal rhythms of production. Resin harvested in the spring and early summer was more fluid and easier to work with, while that of the autumn was thicker and more concentrated. Raw resin contained impurities, bark fragments, dirt particles, trapped insects. To make it usable, it was necessary to purify it. The raw material was placed in a metal container and heated gently over a fire. Temperature control was a critical aspect. The heat had to be sufficient to melt the resin, but not so intense as to burn it. Overheated resin produced toxic smoke and lost useful properties. As it melted, the impurities separated due to differences in density. Lighter materials floated to the surface, where they were removed with a wooden spoon. Heavier materials sank to the bottom. The clean resin in the middle layer was poured into molds or storage containers. With the purified resin, craftsmen prepared different formulations for specific uses: powdered charcoal to create resistant adhesive, beeswax to provide flexibility, animal fat to produce medicinal ointments. Each formulation represented specialized knowledge passed from master to apprentice over generations. For the production of navel tar, destructive distillation was an operation that could last several days and required constant supervision. The kilns needed to be carefully sealed to ensure that the amount of oxygen remained extremely low. The wood decomposed thermally over days, releasing tar that was collected at the base of the structure. The resulting tar could be used directly or heated further to produce pitch. The entire process required skill, patience, and a deep understanding of the materials. The master craftsmen who mastered these techniques were valued professionals whose knowledge could mean the difference between a ship that sailed for decades and one that succumbed to the waves on its first voyage. Pine resin was, without a doubt, an extraordinary material, but there were limits to what it could do. It sealed, glued, protected superficially, and illuminated. However, when it came to making a fabric or leather genuinely water-repellent, transforming the very nature of the material so that it rejected moisture instead of simply blocking it externally, resin alone was not enough. Medieval people needed something else. And the discovery of this second material, as important as the first, did not come from the forests. It came from the grazing fields, from the hands of shepherds, and from daily contact with one of the most common and useful animals of medieval Europe. Let us transport ourselves now to a different landscape. Rolling hills covered in grass, dotted by white spots that move slowly under a cloud-laden sky. We are in a sheep pasture somewhere in England, Spain, France, or any other of the countless European territories where sheep farming was a central economic activity. The shepherd who tends this flock is a simple man. He cannot read. He has probably never traveled beyond the neighboring county. But he knows his sheep like few others, and he has noticed something strange. After spending hours handling his sheep, shearing them, examining them, his hands become covered in a greasy and shiny substance, an oily layer that accumulates on the skin and does not come off easily with water. And he realized that, on rainy days, the water runs off his hands as if they were made of polished stone. His work clothes, impregnated over months by constant contact with the raw wool of the sheep, also began to repel the rain. Drops that previously would have been absorbed by the fabric now roll off the surface and fall to the ground without leaving a trace. This observation, made by countless anonymous shepherds over generations, led to the discovery of one of the most remarkable natural substances ever used by human beings: lanolin. Derived from the Latin lana, wool, and oleum, oil. Lanolin is a complex waxy substance secreted by the sebaceous glands connected to each wool follicle on the sheep's body. Just as humans produce sebum to protect their skin, sheep produce lanolin to protect their wool. Each fiber of wool that grows on the animal's body is coated by a microscopic layer of this yellowish waxy substance, which gives the wool extraordinary natural waterproofing properties. It is thanks to lanolin that sheep can graze comfortably during storms that soak everything around them. The rain simply runs off the surface of the wool without penetrating to the animal's skin. Sheep, over millions of years of evolution, developed their own biological waterproofing system, a natural engineering of remarkable elegance. Lanolin has a melting point situated between 38 and 42 degrees Celsius, 100.4 to 107.6 degrees Fahrenheit, slightly above the animal's normal body temperature. This melting temperature is a brilliant evolutionary detail. It allows the lanolin to remain semi-solid on the surface of the wool under normal conditions, maintaining its protective function, but to liquefy and redistribute itself over the animal's body when the temperature rises slightly, ensuring uniform coverage. Medieval shepherds knew none of this scientific information, but they knew the practical results, and they began to seek ways to extract it in larger quantities and to apply it systematically to their fabrics, leathers, and equipment. The extraction of lanolin required patience and considerable physical labor. The first step was to select the correct raw material. Not all wool was equally rich in lanolin. Medieval people learned that certain regions of the sheep's body produced wool with significantly higher concentrations. The shoulder and flank areas tended to accumulate more protective grease. Furthermore, different breeds produced varying amounts. Fine wool breeds, such as the precursors to the modern merino, could contain up to 30% lanolin relative to the total weight of the wool, yielding between 250 and 300 milliliters of extract per fleece. The most skillful shepherds learned to identify the sheep with the greasiest wool and practiced reproductive selection to maximize production, an early form of genetic improvement. The extraction process itself was ingeniously simple in principle, though laborious in execution. Large quantities of water were heated in cauldrons to temperatures between 90 and 95 degrees Celsius. The raw wool, unwashed and still covered in lanolin dirt and environmental residues, was submerged in this hot water. The heat melted the lanolin, which detached from the fibers and became suspended in the water. To assist in the separation, they added a cleaning agent, grated olive oil-based soap or detergents manufactured from wood ashes, a primitive form of lye. Approximately 1 hour of sustained heating was necessary to ensure complete extraction. The workers kept the temperature stable, understanding that insufficient heating wasted lanolin and excessive heat degraded its quality. After heating, the wool was removed while the liquid was still hot. The extraction liquid was then left to stand overnight to cool completely. As the temperature dropped below the melting point, the lanolin solidified and, being less dense than water, rose to the surface of the container. The next morning, a layer of waxy material floated on the water and could be collected with wooden spoons. The material was then filtered through straining cloths, a process repeated several times for greater purity. A fine wool fleece produced approximately 200 milliliters of raw lanolin. A session processing multiple fleeces could provide enough material to waterproof the clothes and equipment of an entire family. The raw extract had an olive green color and a sticky consistency. Although it was not suitable for cosmetics without further processing, it was perfectly functional for practical needs. Purification was done through repeated cycles of heating and cooling, which gradually separated the lanolin from contaminants. At each cycle, they removed the cleaner top layers and discarded the sediment. Raw lanolin found uses that went far beyond waterproofing fabrics. In leather care, the substance penetrated the structure of boots, belts, and horse harnesses, restoring the flexibility of pieces that had become stiff from exposure to moisture and cold. Treated items lasted significantly longer, a crucial saving for families who could not afford frequent replacements. In human skin protection, lanolin was applied directly to the hands and face during brutal winters, creating protective barriers against painful cracks that could become infected. In tool maintenance, it created an effective barrier against iron corrosion, particularly important in predominantly humid environments. Applications extended to tents, sacks, and various equipment that needed to resist the weather elements. It is fascinating to note that many of these applications have survived to the present day, although often in industrialized forms. Lanolin continues to be used in shoe polishes, machine lubricants, protective creams for babies, and moisturizing cosmetics. Recent studies suggest that many allergic reactions attributed to lanolin are actually caused by pesticide residues present in modern wool, not by the substance itself, which rarely triggers genuine allergic responses. Looking at these two materials that medieval people mastered with such skill, it is impossible not to be impressed by the ingenuity of those people. In an age without a chemical industry, without synthetic polymers, without automated factories, they managed to create a complete survival system using only what nature offered. Pine resin gave them medicines to heal wounds, waterproofing to protect ships and equipment, adhesives to manufacture and repair weapons and tools, and fuel to illuminate the endless nights. Lanolin gave them a substance capable of transforming ordinary fabrics into barriers against the rain, of preserving leather against the wear of time, of protecting human skin against the brutal cold, and of keeping their metal tools free from rust. Together, these two materials formed a survival arsenal so comprehensive that it is difficult to imagine how medieval life would have been possible without them. And perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story is the way this knowledge was developed and transmitted. There were no chemistry universities, no printed technical manuals, no scientific conferences. The knowledge about the collection, processing, and application of pine resin and lanolin was passed down orally, from father to son, from master to apprentice, from healer to assistant. Each generation learned from the previous one, refined the techniques through its own experience, and passed the improved knowledge to the next generation. It was a slow but extraordinarily effective system of innovation. Medieval methods remain valid today, precisely because they solved real problems using sustainable techniques that required only resources controlled by families, trees, sheep, fire, and human labor. There was no dependence on complex supply chains or inaccessible technologies. This self-sufficiency was a fundamental necessity of the medieval world. It is also notable how these two materials complemented each other almost perfectly. Pine resin was more effective as an external barrier, creating protective layers over surfaces, filling gaps and coating materials with waterproof films. Lanolin operated in a fundamentally different way. Instead of simply covering the surface of a material, it penetrated its structure, integrating with the fibers and altering its intrinsic properties. A fabric treated with lanolin was not merely covered by a protective layer. Its own fibers had become hydrophobic. Where resin sealed, lanolin transformed. Where resin blocked, lanolin repelled. Together, they offered a complete solution for practically any challenge related to water and deterioration that the medieval world could present. The history of pine resin and lanolin is ultimately a story about human capacity to observe, learn, and adapt. It is the story of shepherds who noticed that their hands became waterproof after touching sheep and transformed that casual observation into a survival technology. It is the story of healers who saw a tree seal its own wounds with resin and thought, if it works for the tree, maybe it will work for us too. It is the story of shipbuilders who developed complex distillation techniques to produce the tar that kept their fleets afloat. It is the story of craftsmen who created adhesives so strong that their arrows could pierce armor without falling apart. It is the story of entire families who collected resinous pine knots to light their homes during the long European winters. It is, above all, a story of resilience, of ingenuity, and of a relationship with the natural world that was both pragmatic and deeply respectful. This knowledge, which sustained civilizations for centuries, deserves to be remembered not just as historical curiosities, but as living testimonies to the human capacity to find elegant solutions to complex problems, using nothing more than the resources that nature generously offers. If this journey through the lost secrets of the Middle Ages has piqued your curiosity, If you have been as fascinated as we are by the ingenuity of our ancestors, then help us continue unearthing these stories forgotten by time. Subscribe to the channel to follow new documentary narratives like this one. Leave your like so that more people can discover the wisdom that the past has to teach us, and share in the comments what surprised you most in this story. After all, every comment, every like, and every new subscription is like a drop of resin that strengthens and protects this project, allowing it to continue growing and bringing to you the secrets that time tried to hide.